Christians, by making this claim, lost all their property, lost their friends, lost their reputation, and then 360,000 of them within the first 100 years were brutally murdered in the Roman Colosseum. 360,000. I stood right in the middle of the Roman Colosseum. I thought, what about to get political power, guys? Then talk about to get political power. That's what these Christians did.
You just have to love Cliff Jr. in this one. How Cliff Jr., I'm gonna loud talk you, and make this exaggerated number of Christians in the first couple of 100 years that were persecuted. And there's actually zero archaeological evidence that demonstrates that 360,000 Christians were persecuted in the first century, second century of Christianity. Never happened. It never happened to that degree. Was there persecution of Christians under the Roman Empire? Yes. Guess what? There was persecution of Druids during the Roman Empire. There was persecution of the cult of Dionysus, especially for their religious practice of the Bacchae, because it was held at night. And the Romans didn't like the fact that it was held at night, and Dionysus was one of their gods. And they persecuted those people. The cult of Isis was heavily persecuted during the first and second century of the Roman Empire. You see, many religions were persecuted during the Roman Empire. It's just that none of those religions began to take political power in Rome, began to hold office in Rome. And so therefore, their persecution has been highlighted, where the persecution of these other religions were not highlighted. You know who was the most persecuted religion during the first and second century of Roman Empire? It was the Jews. Yes, the Jews. And this wasn't something that was empire-wide. No persecution was empire-wide, and I'm going to prove that and show that to you in a minute. But most of the persecution was done by different governors throughout the Roman Empire at the behest of the emperor, but it wasn't something that was done empire-wide. There was no decree that was done empire-wide. Even the persecution of Nero and Diocletian towards Christians was not empire-wide. The persecution of Diocletian was roughly around 3,000 to 3,500 people, which still it's a high number. I'm not saying it's a low number. I'm not saying it should happen. But 365,000 is a far cry from that. But even under Diocletian, you did not see 365,000 people who were persecuted, roughly 3,000 to 3,500. Nero, it is claimed by Tacitus that he blamed Christians. It was claimed by Tacitus that Nero instructed mobs to go kill Christians. It was blamed by Tacitus that Nero said that you would tar and pitch Christians and then light them in order to light the streets at night. These were things that were claimed by Tacitus that was written 50 to 100 years after the so-called event happened. So no one was going to go against that because the Julio-Claudian clan had now been disposed, and the Flavians, the Piso family, was now in charge of the Roman Empire. And so these were more political exaggerations, propaganda, in order to gain more favoritism with the Flavians, in order for them to gain more political power. Because let's remember, Tacitus' first job is not a historian. That is something he dabbled in. His first job was a Roman governor. The same with Pliny. He was a Roman governor. And although Pliny did persecute Christians, he did not persecute 365,000 of them. He did persecute some of them without warrant, persecuted some of them with outside of the Roman legal system, which requires an investigation, and he did some of that. Yes, Pliny, the one that Christians love to talk about, he did those sorts of things. But when we get into, let's say, let's look at during the time frame of Hadrian, which is a perfect time frame, as well as the time frame of what's his name, Seputus. is a great time frame. So we're looking at late 2nd century, mid to late 2nd century into the early 3rd century, where we have these two different Roman emperors, as well as Marcus Aurelius fits into that time frame, where there was no empire-wide persecution of Christians. As a matter of fact, Hadrian said that being Christian alone is not enough of a reason to persecute Christians, that there must be some other type of issue that causes you to persecute Christians. And what was the main reason for persecuting Christians and Jews? And oftentimes to Romans, especially in early 1st century, in 1st century, Jews and Christians were one of the same. They looked upon Christians as just a sect of Judaism, not an independent religion of their own. And there were so many variations of them that they just lobbed them in the same. So when there was Jewish revolts, they persecuted both Jews and Christians. But Jews were heavily persecuted in 1st century and early 2nd century because they were still trying to revolt against the Roman Empire. Now, Jews had a special little deal where as long as they paid the temple tax, then they would be able to worship their monotheism, whereas Christians didn't have a temple tax provision for them. So they were a little bit more heavily persecuted in the 2nd century. But later, mid to late 2nd century, Hadrian gave more leniency. Marcus Aurelius gave more leniency. In the first 9 years of Septimius Severus, I can say Severus better, Severus's reign, he was incredibly lenient towards Christians. As a matter of fact, his personal doctor is said to have been Christian. He prevented Christians from being killed by mobs. Now, after his 10th year, around his 10th year, there was more persecution during his reign, and that was happening only in North Africa, and it was done by local governors. And we have differences even within Christian writings. So, for instance, Eusebius, who is writing about 120 years after the issues with Irenaeus. So Irenaeus is around 170, 180 CE. Irenaeus had a letter waiting to be martyred with some other Christians, but it wasn't for certain if it actually happened with the Church of Lyon. But even though Irenaeus didn't write about his huge persecution, Eusebius, writing in the 300 CE, talks about this huge persecution that happened with Irenaeus, but he's writing 120 years later, exaggerating the numbers. Even Tertullian, early church father, Tertullian, 1st century, he wrote things of exaggeration by saying that, anytime there's earthquake or landslide or pestilence or famine, then they say, away with all the Christians, kill all the Christians. Tertullian wrote this inflammatory type of messaging in the 2nd century to early 2nd century to inflame the idea that Christians were being persecuted wholesale across the whole Roman Empire, when this just is not true. Were they persecuted? Yes. But they were persecuted at the same rate as the Jews, at the same rate as the Druids, at the worshippers of Dionysus, the cult of Isis. If you had any issue with the Roman government as a group and didn't behold to the imperial cult, you were persecuted. It's just as simple as that. And there are plenty of other variations of Christianity who persecuted each other. Christians persecuted Christians. And then after the Council of Nicaea, and Christianity became an authorized religion at the Edict of Milan, and then the Council of Nicaea organized it. But when Theodosius became emperor in 381, Christians wholesale persecuted other variations of Christians more so than anybody else. So more Christians were killed by Christians than were killed by non-Christians. So Cliff Jr., you might want to do a little historical studies before you start talking. But what do you guys think? And there are plenty of other examples, but what do you guys think? Comment, subscribe, like, share, and always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.